So in some conversations, I'm getting this kind of impression that people really want to build a failure-free system. So with zero failures in it. I'm more from the standpoint or from the perspective that failures are part of the system. And as you mentioned, like how the system is able to work under those conditions is like the key element. Is really this dynamic system needs to identify a failure. It needs to be able to work with that failure, and your organization should know when something goes wrong. From your experience, how many companies are operating more like in a hope way or using hope as a strategy? Is it still a big portion?
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of companies that are in kind of hope-driven development, but I think it's changing as well, right? But maybe that's, maybe I have the bias of the customers I've been talking to are already kind of understanding resilience to some extent. So I think, like my sampling, sample is biased, but, but you still, hear stories and you see it in the news, right? Where people do not expect failure. And when there's failure, there's direct blame. That's typically the very old way of thinking that, system is unfailable. And if there's a failure, it has to be somebody to blame, right? And that's a very old way of thinking about it, because like you said, your system is in perpetual mode of failure. There's no part of the system, especially if you think about the social, technical system, right? There's always something going wrong, right? So, like thinking that there's not going to be any failure is just
Not
basically
reality.
wishful thinking, right? And because something is going to happen, something will go wrong eventually. And often it's not what you think is going to happen, right? So, yeah, it would be well known if the system would never fail, right? Well,
Yeah,
they do.
absolutely. And I'm always like curious about learning from failure. So is there something in your mind, any story where something really went wrong as you have done chaos engineering?
What do you mean? Something
Some
went wrong from?
So not from the technical point of view, more like so let's imagine you have done a game day, a chaos exercise, whatever, and then something was not working as planned.
It's often like that. It's rarely goes as planned, right? Because like people have assumptions, and typically those assumptions are completely wrong, right? It just depends on the degree at which you define your hypothesis, right? So it's easy to always have a valid hypothesis if you have a very loose hypothesis, but if you have a very precise
Specific.
specific with time, people, like a really precise hypothesis, then typically something goes, unplanned or wrong. That's why you need to be, careful what you're doing. That's why you need to first do it in a test environment or in a control environment, or if you do it even in production environment, you need to do it in a situations where your blast radius, or kind of the number of customers that you're potentially impacted is reduced or controlled, or like it's a certain type of customers. So for example, I've done work with the BMW group, right, recently, and they've done their game days in production, but they've done it at a time where there was minimum customer on the systems, and even if those would have been impacted, it was a certain type of customer that it would have been a big problem. So it's kind of very fine grained definition of or kind of shard of the system where you apply the failure, and then you can learn from that, and then as you control it, you can expand it. Potentially you can put it in different situations, but yeah, typically you want really control, very precise. Like honestly, I've never seen an experiment that would go as planned. That's the funny thing, is like you always learn something from a chaos experiment or game day, because like our assumptions about the systems is more often than not completely wrong.